There's a business almost nobody takes seriously anymore. No storefront redesign every 2 years. No influencer running the marketing. Most people drive past 3 or 4 of them a week without a second thought. And that's exactly the mistake. Because underneath the fluorescent lights and the folding tables sits one of the most quietly profitable small business models operating in America today. A business with fewer employees than a single Starbucks shift, margins most restaurant owners would trade a limb for, and a reputation so tied to organized crime that its name literally became the term for hiding illegal money. This is why laundromats are one of America's best cash businesses, and why the people who understand the real math behind them are buying up as many as they can find. Start with the assumption almost everyone makes. A laundromat looks like a room full of old machines that take quarters. Simple, low tech, not the kind of business anyone builds real wealth from. If that's the read, the actual mechanics underneath get missed entirely. And so, does one of the cleanest revenue formulas in small business. Here's what's actually happening. Every laundromat is built around 2 numbers: how many machines it has, and how many times each machine gets used in a day. A typical U.S. laundromat runs around 24 washers and 16 dryers. Each load costs the customer somewhere between $4 and $8, depending on the market. Multiply that price by how many times a machine turns over in a day, multiply that by the number of machines, multiply that by the days in the month, and the entire business model is sitting right there in one equation. There's no sales team closing that transaction. No invoice. No negotiation. A customer loads a machine, pays before the cycle even starts, and walks away. The machine repeats that exact transaction dozens of times a day without anyone touching it. That's the part that makes laundromats different from almost every other small business. The revenue isn't earned once and resold. It's the same handful of machines generating the same repeatable transaction hour after hour, with no marketing spend required to make it happen again tomorrow. Revenue is only half the story, and it's the half that fools people. A restaurant can post 6 figures in monthly sales and still barely survive once payroll, food cost, and rent take their cut. So the real question isn't how much a laundromat brings in, it's how much of that actually stays. This is where laundromats separate themselves from almost every other cash-facing small business. Annual revenue for an individual store ranges enormously, from roughly $150,000 for a small, older operation up to $700,000 or more for a modern, well-run one, with federal data now putting the national average above $500,000. But the number that matters more is the margin sitting underneath it. A well-run laundromat typically nets 20 to 35%, and some of the strongest operators push past that. Compare that to the businesses people usually assume are the safe bets. A restaurant often nets somewhere in the low single digits after everything is paid. Most retail sits in a similar range. A laundromat gets there almost entirely because of one line item: labor. A self-service store can run with a single part-time attendant or none at all. The machines do the selling, the folding is optional, and the biggest recurring costs are utilities and rent, both of which are predictable and controllable, not the volatile, ever-rising expense that staffing is everywhere else. It isn't just that laundromats make money. It's that they keep an unusually large share of every dollar that walks through the door, because almost nothing about the business depends on paying people to run it. So, quick pause before we get into why this business is called a cash business in the first place, and what that phrase actually used to mean. If breakdowns like this are useful to you, subscribe now so the next one lands in your feed. Back to it. There's a reason the phrase cash business carries a little more weight when it's attached to a laundromat specifically. The story goes that Al Capone bought up laundromats in Chicago during Prohibition specifically to disguise his bootlegging profits, and that this is where the term money laundering actually comes from. It's one of the most repeated origin stories in finance. Most historians now consider it a myth. The term itself didn't enter common use until the Watergate era in the 1970s, decades after Capone was already in prison. And he wasn't convicted for laundering money, he was convicted for tax evasion. The legend outlived the facts. But the myth points at something real. Cash-heavy businesses, laundromats, car washes, casinos, genuinely were favorites for organized crime throughout the 20th century, because a business that collects small, constant cash payments is extremely hard for anyone outside it to audit. Illegal cash could be blended in with legitimate earnings, and from the outside, nobody could tell the difference. That's exactly why the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970 forced banks to start reporting any cash transaction over $10,000, and why cash-intensive businesses have carried extra regulatory attention ever since. Today, that same cash-heavy nature is the opposite of a liability for a legitimate operator. It's the appeal. There's no accounts receivable, no client who pays net 60, no invoice sitting unpaid for 3 months. The customer pays, the cycle runs, the money is already in hand before the transaction is even finished. Even with the industry's shift toward card and app payments, now used at the majority of U.S. locations, the underlying model hasn't changed. Get paid first, deliver the service second. Almost no small business runs that far ahead on cash flow. None of this holds up if the demand isn't reliable. A business can have great margins and still fail if customers only show up when the economy is good. So the real question is what's actually driving people through the door and whether that demand survives a downturn. The answer is renters. The majority of laundromat customers, well over half, are people renting apartments without an in-unit washer and dryer. That's not a discretionary trip. It's not a purchase someone can postpone because the market dropped or a paycheck got tighter. Clothes still need to get clean. The average customer visits more than twice a week, and demand clusters hard in the evenings, when a huge share of the day's revenue comes through in just a few hours. That's a fundamentally different demand curve than most small businesses run on. Restaurants lose customers when people cut back on eating out. Retail slows the moment discretionary spending tightens. Laundry doesn't have that discretionary window, which is a large part of why some industry data puts laundromats' 5-year survival rate as high as 90 to 95%, an extraordinarily high number for a small business category. Laundromat demand doesn't track the stock market. It tracks how many renters live within walking distance, and that number barely moves, recession or not. At this point, it sounds close to a guaranteed win, and that's exactly where naive money gets burned. Every strength in this business has a matching risk sitting right underneath it, and skipping past that risk is how a good on-paper laundromat turns into a money pit. Getting in the door isn't cheap. Opening a new laundromat typically costs anywhere from $80,000 to $500,000 depending on size, location, and whether the space is built from scratch or bought as an existing operation. Equipment alone commonly runs close to $125,000. And unlike a lot of small businesses, that equipment is the entire product. When a washer breaks, that machine generates zero revenue until it's fixed, and repairs on commercial machines aren't cheap. Utilities are the other pressure point. In an efficient store with modern, high-efficiency machines, utilities can run as low as 15% of revenue. In an older store with outdated equipment, that number can climb past 40%, swallowing most of the margin that made the business attractive in the first place. The industry even has a nickname for these neglected, outdated locations: zombie mats. Same square footage, same neighborhood, same customer base as a well-run store next door, but running on old machines, no reinvestment, and margins a fraction of what they should be. The gap between a well-run laundromat and a zombie mat isn't small. It's the difference between a business that throws off 6 figures in cash flow a year and one that barely covers its own rent. And from the sidewalk, they can look identical. Given how much can go wrong, it's worth asking why serious capital is moving into this space right now instead of staying away from it. The answer is that the operators getting it right are professionalizing a business that for decades, nobody bothered to professionalize. Branded, tech-enabled operators are pulling away from the legacy owner-operator model. One national branded chain's disclosed 2024 franchise data showed an average gross revenue above $470,000 per location, with its top-performing store clearing over $700,000. Figures that would have sounded absurd for a coin laundry a generation ago. Wash and fold and pickup and delivery services, once treated as an afterthought, can lift total revenue by 20 to 40% on top of the base self-service income. Card payments, app-based access, and remote machine monitoring are replacing the model where an owner physically drove to the store to check if anything was broken. At the same time, national and regional chains are quietly acquiring independent operators, consolidating a market that's still overwhelmingly fragmented. Most locations in the U.S. remain independently owned. That fragmentation is exactly what's drawing outside capital in, a large, stable, recession-resistant market with no dominant player yet, sitting right underneath everyone's radar. What started as a room full of coin machines is turning into one of the most quietly professionalized small-cap asset classes in the country, Proof that a business doesn't need to be exciting to be one of the best cash generators in America. It just needs to solve a problem people can never stop having. And that idea, an unglamorous, essential business quietly built on the exact same principle, doesn't stop at laundry. There's another industry running on that same underlying formula. A service nobody can put off, delivered by a business most people never think twice about, except this one doesn't run on small transactions spread evenly through the year. It runs on one brutal, short window where a single breakdown can turn into a same-day payday worth thousands. That's HVAC. And the way those companies actually make their money in the middle of summer has almost nothing to do with the number people assume it does. That's exactly what the next video breaks down.